So Primo Cycles is a company that I've really been into lately. Carlos and Pasquale are two guys that live in Portland, Oregon. They're a small company, like a really small company, it's just the two of them. And they've basically gone all in on their brand, which provides super nice, well thought out bikes for budget-minded cyclists. Their first release was the steel frame Dame, which is a budget drop bar gravel bike at $900 US in late 2025. The Dame is just really good value. You can check out my review of that bike down in the description below. But in this video, we're actually talking about their second offering, which is the Mono. Now this bike is meant to be a return to basics type of bike, meant to do everything you need it to do without any of the fancy bells and whistles. At $800 US, it represents really good value for a complete bike. Yes, I know you can find a department store bike or a used bike for less, but for a new bike of this spec, $800 is just objectively good value. So what is it? Well, it's not a knobby tired road bike, that's for sure. It's also not a rigid mountain bike. It's not even what I would consider a flat bar gravel bike, and I definitely wouldn't call it a hybrid bike. The Mono is just, well, it's just a bike. Now, if I had to categorize it, I'd call it an ATB, or like an all-terrain bike, similar to the Husky Dogler, if you've ever seen their stuff. Basically, it's just meant to be a simple bike that can be a grocery getter or a commuter, but it has enough off-road capability to hit some dirt trails on the weekend. Now, geometry-wise, it kind of stands out as unique. An all-road gravel bike like the Blackheart All-Road, for instance, is not really close in comparison. And then my least aggressive mountain bike is the Newhouse Hummingbird, and the Mono isn't even in the same ballpark. Even the Primos Dame is very different in terms of geometry when compared to the Mono. Now, interestingly, the trail figure and the chainstays are actually quite similar to the Ritchie Outback, which I found surprising given that the form factor is so different. But you can definitely see some similarities in the geometry. The main difference, of course, is that the Mono is much longer in the front end, presumably to account for the flat handlebar, which doesn't extend as far as the drop handlebar and stem. Nonetheless, the ride experience is completely different from the Outback, but it is kind of interesting to note that the Mono is designed to have a relatively relaxed and stable geometry, much like the Outback. Now, the weight of the complete bike on my scale in size medium with the pedals installed is just under 29 pounds, which is a little bit heavier than the stated 26.2 pounds, but I'm pretty sure that the stated weight is without pedals. And then all the details like drivetrain, brakes, mounts, and other frame features are in the first look video, so I'll point you to that video for just the basic specs. In this video, I want to talk about the ride experience and some of the modifications that I made to the bike and any dislikes that I had with the bike. So starting with the changes that I made to the bike, the stock handlebars were actually pretty narrow, measuring in at 635 millimeters wide, which for most people would actually be totally fine. In my case, I just wanted something a little bit wider, so I put on a set of Ritchie Coyote bars and actually shortened the stem a little bit to this 80 millimeter stem. Now, the stock stem is pretty long at around 100 millimeters, and at the time, I felt like it was way too long, but more on that in just a minute. And then, of course, completely unnecessarily, I swapped out the seat post for a matching Ritchie Classic silver post, and you also notice that the saddle is different from the stock one as well. This specialized power saddle actually, in my opinion, is not as comfortable as the stock saddle that came on the Mono. It turns out I actually wanted the Mono saddle on my other gravel bike just because I like it so much. So I kind of stole the saddle from this bike. Just goes to show you how much I like the stock saddle on the Primos Mono. I also have these cargo cages from the company Fauna Components up in Vancouver. Now these are actually really cool. They're adjustable in length and they're made in Canada from stainless steel. Now they're meant for 3-pack mounts on the fork legs, but one thing that I noticed about the Mono, actually as well as the first generation Dame, is that the 3 mounting holes are not perfectly aligned. On both bikes, the holes are actually misaligned to the point where a 3-pack mount won't actually fit using all the 3 mounting bolts. Now, fortunately, in my case here, you can kind of get away with just using 2 of the mounting bolts for the cages, but it is something to note. So those are pretty much all the changes that I made. I actually also swapped the pedals from the stock plastic pedals to some resin race face pedals here. One of the things that I noticed when riding the bike is that the front end, despite having a relatively slack head tube and a trail in the high 70s, actually feels pretty twitchy. As in when you're descending fast, loose dirt trails, the front end doesn't feel super planted like it would on an actual mountain bike. Rather, it feels really active, and I kind of get the sense that I need to always be monitoring the steering angle rather than just kind of pointing the bike in the general direction. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing, and to be honest, most people probably aren't going to buy a bike like this as a dedicated mountain bike. But when you do start pushing it a little bit, it does feel a little bit squirrely in the front end. Now, having said that, I did just mention that that I swapped the stock stem for one that's 20 millimeters shorter. Now, generally speaking, this is going to move the rider's center of mass slightly backward, effectively unweighting the handlebars a little bit. And the shorter stem typically does make the steering feel a little bit twitchy just from a kinematic standpoint. It sort of allows for smaller inputs to correspond to larger relative steering outputs. So take my experience with a grain of salt. If you ride the bike in its stock form, it's possible and highly likely that the steering will feel just fine. So overall, the bike is super fun to ride. It definitely brings me back to the days of riding a late 90s Specialized hard rock with no suspension down some sketchy trails that I had no business being on. It's just fun. Now presently, my wife and I actually both ride this bike. She kind of uses it to get around the neighborhood, and she uses it for when we do bike bus to and from school. And I kind of like to use it as a casual mountain bike for the relatively tame trails around my house. Overall, I really like the simplicity of the Mono. Its steel frame and fork will basically last forever, and it just has everything you need and nothing you don't. And then because it's a flat bar bike, the drivetrain is really straightforward. Microshift Advent X is like the perfect application for this bike. There's really no need to upgrade to the Microshift Sword stuff because the biggest benefit and corresponding expense is with the nicer Sword shifters. On this bike, the brakes are also hydraulic, unlike on the Dame, and that's also a function of cost as well. Hydraulic mountain bike brakes are orders of magnitude cheaper than on drop bar bikes, so these Shimano MT200 hydraulic disc brakes are like the perfect spec for this budget bike, and they work really, really well. I also like how the bike features these really wide inner rim width wheels, which pair really nicely with the wide tires that the bike was designed for. And then your external bottom bracket and external cable routing make maintenance and service super easy as well. Now, I'd say that the one thing that most people will probably criticize is that it uses the quick release hub standard. Now, some might argue that the fact that the bike uses the quick release standard makes it feel cheap and therefore like not a serious bike. After all, virtually all modern gravel and mountain bikes have adopted the through axle wheel mounting standard. But I kind of tend to agree with Primos that quick release for this bike is actually a smart decision. Now, to see what I mean, you kind of have to consider who this bike was designed for. Now, in my opinion, the Mono is designed for someone who isn't super serious about cycling tech, but just wants like a legitimately cool and well thought out bike for commuting or just getting around town. Now, one of the main benefits of using the modern through axle design is that most modern high-end wheel sets are designed with this standard. So theoretically, upgrading your wheels down the line would be super straightforward if your frame did have the through axle standard. However, I'd probably wager that people buying the Mono, again, these are casual cyclists or commuters, there's probably no plan to eventually upgrade the wheels. And so sticking with the older and therefore cheaper to manufacture quick release standard poses no apparent downside. Now, the very nature of the quick release also means that taking the wheels on and off of the bike is like a really easy tool-free operation, which might actually make more sense for transporting the bike in a car if, say, you don't have a fancy hitch rack to go with the bike. So I'm going to go ahead and preempt all the comments that address the quick release as a con, and I'll say that personally I think it's perfectly appropriate for this bike. Alright, so that's going to do it for this one. Again, all of the basic specs are in the first look video. I'll have a link to that down in the description. This video was meant to be more of a longer term ride review. You know, the Mono is super capable on-road and off-road, but it's designed around this idea of not taking cycling too seriously and just riding for fun, which is something that I really appreciate. Now, during the testing period, I've personally had a ton of fun with the bike. Again, this is an $800 complete bike, so it's really pretty hard to criticize it for anything. If you have any questions about my experience with the Primos Mono, just feel free to drop them down below. We'll do our best to get back to as many questions as we can. Thanks again for watching, and thanks for subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. We'll see you next time.